Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining us here in this afternoon in July for an exciting topic for us, at least. If you're a sustainability nerd like the rest of us, I hope you're interested in carbon offsets. I myself have long wondered and read articles in passing fancy, but had the amazing opportunity of working on this white paper over the course of the last 6 months, where I learned a lot. And we're really excited to share with you some of what we've learned. And like every journey of knowledge, it just brings up more questions, which is okay. That's part of the journey. So thank you for joining us today for the last of our white paper pandemic series on carbon offsets for the greater LA region. As we get started, just a quick reminder about who we are. So the U.S. Green Building Council Los Angeles is an independent nonprofit. We're affiliated with the Green Building Council that runs the LEED credential and certification that you may know and love. But our mission is a bit different. We're really focused on accelerating sustainability in the built environment here in Southern California to make it a more sustainable region for all. And at the end of the day, we're about people. We can't do anything we do without people. We're about people and community. And so we hope you can find some ways to get engaged with us and the work we're doing. Along those lines, we have a number of committees that speak to some of the various issues that we'll touch on a little bit today. I'm not going to go through every one of these. I will point out, though, that our LA Sustainability Executives Roundtable, or LASER, was instrumental in the development of this white paper. And that is a group that's really a mix of the leading sustainability executives for the largest companies in our region. They've been incredibly resourceful and just a great group where we're trying to make sure that 1 + 1 = more than 2 in leading sustainability for the region. We also launched last year a talent portal about a week before the pandemic hit that's really meant to be a centralized resource for people to go to learn. We have featured employers, we have job postings, we have all of our recorded content available for free, like the event you're about to have today. So I'd really encourage you to check out our talent portal. We had about 200 digital events last year. I hope you're shocked, because I was shocked at the end of the year when I realized we had that many, with over 11,000 attendees, and almost all that content's up on our website. And a lot of it is in really focused, interesting topics. So I hope you can check that out when you have a moment. Speaking of that, we have some good content coming up here in the next month or so. I'm really excited about a tour we're going to do. So one of the things we developed during this pandemic are these virtual tours. We're doing a tour of the Floor 401 lofts, which is a project on Skid Row that's been LEED Platinum certified. Really speaks to some of the issues that we're looking at right now around challenges in affordable housing and how do we create healthier environments for the occupants of these buildings. We have some training coming up on Envision, which is a certification for sustainable infrastructure. I actually got my Envision SP here about 2-3 weeks ago now, and I think it's a great approach to a lot of these issues. We have a meet and greet for our Net Zero Accelerator, which is a program for startups in the built environment, where you can actually meet some of the latest and greatest startups that are out there really pushing net zero adoption and practice here in our buildings. And then one of the events I'm excited about early in September, we're having an event focused on indoor air quality on construction sites, which hasn't been talked about nearly enough. And as always, if you feel inspired by any of our content, please, if you can spare anything, we try to provide as much of this as we can for free. You can donate now by texting GREEN to 707070. And we appreciate your engagement and support of the work we do. So with that, I'm even 2 minutes early. I should have gone longer on my intro because I'm still doing my sort of welcome remarks. But want to say thank you again for attending our event today. In terms of our agenda, I'm going to cover a little of an intro. I'm going to give an overview of the white paper, some of what we covered in the white paper, and some of the findings there. And then we're going to go into a panel discussion. I'm really excited for our panelists today. I've had a number of discussions over the past 6 months of putting together this paper that felt like a podcast to me that we should have recorded when we had them originally. But this is an incredibly complex topic, as you're about to learn a little bit more about. And you'll probably leave this today with some answers, but also some more questions. And I think that's always a sign maybe of a good educational session. We are going to have some time for Q&A at the end of the panel. My ask to you is, if you have questions, please drop them in the chat. That way you'll remember them, we'll remember them, and we'll be able to get to them at the end of the panel. And then we're going to break at about 5:15 from Q&A and just leave things open to have a little bit of networking. We can create breakouts if people are interested, but one of the things we found that during the pandemic we all could use a little bit of time to not just be talked at, but to talk with other people. And so we wanted to make sure we create some space for that at the end of every event. So I'm going to dive into the meat of the discussion today, and really this is one of those things, as I mentioned to kick things off, if you weren't here yet, that as a sustainability nerd for a long time now, I've been very intrigued by the potential of carbon offsets. Look, there's no question as we sit here in July on another year of record fires in the midst of a record drought here in the Western United States that we are feeling the impacts of climate change. In some ways, I think it's accelerating for those of us who thought it was already happening. It's accelerating faster than we thought it would be. And that this is causing, direct financial impacts for companies here, for companies around the world, for people in their lives, and that's something that needs to be addressed. And the reality is that on our current pathway right now, we're still generating more carbon year by year. And look, I know you're probably attending this. You already are a believer in the work we do, but I just want to stress that we need to figure out ways to move faster and be more innovative in order to tackle the climate challenge. And to get back on track, countries would need to increase their emissions reductions goals by 5 times in 2020 in order to get to where we need to be to fend off some of the biggest impacts of climate change, to hit that least cost pathway. And that's a lot of work. So we say that in not way to be alarmist, just to say that, hey, we need to be collaborative, we need to be working together. And carbon offsets present one of those interesting opportunities to create a market around ways to be collaborative that we need to be mindful of. And why are we talking about this issue now? I think one of the things that we've seen, over the last year was this incredible ramp up of commitments to going net zero across your portfolio as a company. We can talk about what does that mean? Is that net zero emissions? Is that net zero carbon? I think we're all still kind of figuring that out. And I think a lot of the companies that have made these commitments on some level are trying to figure that out. And whether companies are doing that today or doing it in the future, some companies think they're going to reach that in the near term or the long term. I put some results from a survey we did for our laser group here on the right-hand side of the screen. But some people think that they're going to hit that net zero in the next 6 to 10 years. Some people think it's going to take longer than that. The reality is a lot of companies are just diving into that, and making a commitment to this is really only the first part of the challenge. It's actually working through that commitment that's going to be the hard part going forward. And again, time is of the essence. I think we're going to continue to see net zero commitments go up. I really believe personally that we're at this sort of transformative moment in valuation where we're going to look back and, look, right now we're seeing that climate risk disclosure is starting to become something that people are going to have to report on. We already know that companies like BlackRock are asking their analysts to make sure they're taking in climate to risk as they're doing valuations. So we're at this moment right now where I think the companies that are really addressing climate in what they do, they're going to have higher valuations long term. And those that don't, they're going to start to see their valuation shift, in some cases pretty dramatically. And I think that's going to play out here over the next few years. And so it's something to think about as we talk about offsets, because a lot of these companies are going to be looking to offsets as part of the portfolio of solutions to solve some of their challenges. And before we dive in, and this is something that we cover in the paper, there needs to be some definitions. I've simplified this probably far more than some of the experts on our panel here would like to see me do in this slide right here. But a carbon offset, ultimately, what is that? I think a lot of people joining us are probably like, what does that even mean? That's a reduction in greenhouse gas emissions in one location, or an increase in carbon storage that can be used to compensate for emissions that occur elsewhere. So there's probably a lot more we can add to that definition, but we want to establish some of that up front. And also a carbon credit is a transferable instrument or allowance, often certified by a government or an independent body to represent that emission reduction of 1 metric ton of CO2. And then a renewable energy credit, which sometimes gets confused with carbon offsets or carbon credits, is a tradable, non-tangible energy commodity that's used here in the US to serve as a proof of that 1 megawatt hour of electricity was generated from an eligible renewable energy resource and is connected to the grid. So that's something different than a carbon offset or carbon credit. And then there's also this other element that's been really talked about a lot in the last few years around our low carbon fuel standards. It's a regulatory tool that people can use to create value when they reduce their GHG emissions from transportation. And that includes using alternative fuels like electricity or ethanol or biodiesel. So there's a lot of things going on in the space, and the definitions are really, really important, as we'll hear from our panelists in a little bit, because they have significant market impacts. And so one of the big takeaways from the paper, look, I'm an optimist. I came into this paper like, hey, we're going to figure out how carbon offsets are going to solve some of our big climate challenges here in the LA area. We're going to find some creative solution that's somehow been overlooked. And it's interesting because we talked to some experts around the country, and there actually hasn't been any other region that had come to them as a regional collection of executives to say, how can we collaborate on this issue? And I still think there's a lot of potential for us to collaborate around carbon offsets as something that we do as a region. I think that's a unique approach. But what really came away for us is that, all we need to be focusing our effort, energy, and resources, whether financial or otherwise, on source reduction. Carbon offsets have a role to play. They're part of a portfolio approach to addressing, getting to a net zero portfolio of operations or otherwise. But they're complex, and we have yet to see on often cases if the value is there in some of the offsets. And so, it's important we focus on that source reduction, because ultimately, at the end of the day, that's what we have the most control over. So, if there's a takeaway for you to take today, it's that yes, carbon offsets are part of a potential solution to this challenge that can have big impacts. But at the same time, we need to be looking at our own portfolio of operations and how we can reduce what we're doing, because that's just going to have a big impact long term. And one of the things that we reference here is that an estimate from the Institute of International Finance indicated that voluntary offsetting would need to scale up 15-fold by 2030 in order to meet the Paris Agreement goals. That's a big increase. And look, we've seen a lot of increase in the last year. But again, if we focus on our source emissions, that number of offset, that voluntary offset goals, it can go down, right? It can make things a little bit easier there. And so one of the things that we did in the course of this is we surveyed our laser groups, or LA Sustainability Executives Roundtable, around carbon offsets and tried to be creative. So one of the challenges with carbon offsets is that oftentimes people are purchasing offsets from the other side of the world. And so we wanted to see, would people like to obtain more regional offsets in the regions where they have operations or here in the US? And look, this is a somewhat small and limited survey, but a clear answer was that yes, companies are interested in that. Companies want to find more regional solutions. And I think this speaks also to ESG goals at a lot of the companies that we engage with. They want to be able to show that they're having some of these co-benefits on a local level of offsets. And we'll talk about co-benefits more over the course of this panel. Speaking of co-benefits, people wanted to have some more options. So when we talk about co-benefits, so when someone purchases this carbon offset, there's additional benefits from that reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. So those could be air quality impacts in a positive way, water quality impacts. It could be improvements in soil health, improvements in biodiversity, or improvements in our urban forests. How do we look at social equity and environmental justice as part of this, especially with everything we've learned over the last year? Could offsets play a role there? And this is some of the question that we really asked in this white paper, is that, is there more that we could do on a local level to address social equity and address environmental justice? And it's clear that companies are interested in that. In our survey, companies want to find ways where they can purchase offsets that are going to have these types of co-benefits, and we've listed some of those here. And also looking at different types of options. So the process for a lot of companies who are diving into carbon offsets is a little opaque. There's a little bit of an education curve. So making sure that we're having some clarity about the different types of offset options that are out there. And people were definitely interested in a wide range here. And it was interesting to see renewable energy efficiency at the top, urban reforestation. I'd love for our panel to dive into that a little bit today, because that's something that I thought has so much potential. And you can see that there's interest there as well. And so it's important to see where people are interested in seeing benefits, because at the end of the day, it's people that are making these offset decisions when they're purchasing. And then one of the questions that we really looked at was, could we as a group of companies here in the LA region pool our purchasing power? And people were in general very interested in that. Could we take one company's interest in going net zero and in purchasing offsets for a portion of the portfolio and combine that with 10, 20 other companies and somehow create more opportunity in the market, somehow maybe create new types of projects or methodologies that we could use. And I think there's some value in that, and I'm curious to hear our panel unpack that a little bit today. And if you notice, some of the things that we sort of toyed with was, what would make you interested in this pooling of purchasing power? And that's that increased diversification of projects. It's that shared cost of verifying that a project is actually meaningful and can have impact. Being able to commit to local projects, which may be more expensive, but could make more sense as part of a diversified approach in a portfolio. And making some sort of commitment to support under-resourced communities. So, if we can do that on a local level, there's a high level of interest in that. Maybe we could do that by pooling our purchasing power. And at the end of the day, too, people want to learn from each other. It's that peer-to-peer learning. This is a complex system. And so people were definitely interested in figuring some of that out. So with that, hopefully I've left you with a few more questions than answers. I would encourage you to check out our white paper. I'm really excited about our panel today. And we tried to construct this from a few different perspectives. So I'm going to let our panelists introduce themselves in just a moment. But we really wanted to have someone here who's dealing with the analysis, with the trading side of offsets. What does that look like? We wanted to have someone speak on our panel who's helping to create future classes of offsets and really monitoring the market and making sure things are verifiable and true. And then we wanted to have someone who could really represent that corporate perspective, that building perspective, who's working on a portfolio. And so we've tried to assemble our panel today from that perspective, and I think we did a good job. So with that, I'm going to turn over to our panelists for a moment and ask you to please introduce yourselves and talk a little about what role it is that you and your company play in the offsets process. So Craig, I'm going to go ahead and start with you, and then we'll go from there.
Well, thanks, Ben. I am Craig Ebert, president of the Climate Action Reserve. I've had the privilege of working on climate policy, both domestically and internationally, for 34 years now. Currently, with the Climate Action Reserve, our mission is a dedication to market-based solutions to address the climate crisis. And in that capacity, we serve as an offset project registry here in California for California's compliance market. We also run the largest and highest quality voluntary offset registry across North America with protocol operations in Canada, Mexico, and the US. Looking forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Craig. Thank you for taking the time to be with us today. Natalie?
Hi, everyone. Natalie Tier. I lead our sustainability at Hudson Pacific, which is LA headquartered, but West Coast wide real estate investment trust. We have about 20 million square feet of commercial office space, and most of that is focused on serving leading tech, media, entertainment companies. So sustainability is core to what we do because we care about it, and it's also great for our business. Last year, we went fully carbon neutral in our operations, scope 1 and 2, through a combination of things: source reduction, energy efficiency, renewable energy, and offsets. I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Natalie. And Tim?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. And hello, everyone. My name is Tim Bushman. I'm a science analyst at Carbon Direct. Carbon Direct is a relatively new company founded in 2019 with a mission to scale carbon removal, carbon utilization into a global industry. I work on the advisory side of our business. So the model by convention is we kind of sit alongside buyers in the carbon removal marketplace, carbon offset credit marketplace, and really help kind of guide their voluntary payments and purchases towards what we deem to be high quality opportunities to procure carbon offset credits. So pleasure to be here and looking forward to the conversation.
Thank you, Tim. So for our first question today, and this is kind of a weighty one, but I want to see how you as a group can describe for us some of the important distinctions you see between different offset options and how those impact the market. And I think I'll start with you, Tim, and then I'll probably move to you, Craig. But I would love to hear you kind of cover, some of the definitions that I talked about at the beginning, and just what do you think are those important distinctions that really sort of cause market reaction and distortion?
Certainly, yeah, happy to kick it off. I mean, first of all, I would just say from the outset that the voluntary carbon market is large and growing. Ben, you kind of alluded to that with that sort of scaling factor 15. We've seen sort of past to present over 1 billion credits issued to date. I think the number is now closer to about 1.5 billion credits. There are a handful of major registries, over 100 protocols. So it is a big place, and all points sort of suggest that this market is absolutely going to scale, whether it be a factor 5, 10, 15 directionally. It's certainly looking like it will increase. I think a couple of things that we really think about when trying to understand this space is bidding the different carbon credits into three different buckets. So those projects, those credits that reduce emissions. So that could be a pure play carbon capture project, if you will. There haven't been many of those, but that's an obvious example. Another one is avoided emissions. So like a RED Plus scheme. So you're avoiding the cutting down of a tree, of a forest, avoiding those emissions. And then third is removal. So that's really the space that we operate predominantly in. So projects that pull CO2 out of the atmosphere, dissolve CO2 out of the oceans to help address the climate crisis. So.
Thank you, Tim. And Craig, what are your thoughts like in this market? How do you think these distinctions are important, and how do you see that kind of play out?
It's an interesting question. As Tim points out, there's a wide variety of different offset types. An offset is nothing more than an emission reduction beyond the fence line of a company's operations. And there's a huge realm of possibilities out there. I don't believe we ought to be picking and choosing, in any sort of rank order way, which ones are better than others. There's a wide variety of options. And as you highlighted, Ben, frankly, humanity's out of time to develop it to deal with the climate crisis. We don't have the luxury of waiting. We don't have the luxury of pretending that we can choose one and not the other. Everything needs to be on the table. Now, having said that, whatever actions are taken, the emphasis needs to be on a high level of integrity and environmental quality. So that's important regardless of what source category you're focusing on. Just say one other thing for now about the emphasis on localized reductions. I know that's a big theme of the white paper. That's a great objective, and it's regardless of where you are, companies are always stressing that they want to get localized reductions, and their definition of localized may differ, but it is a huge objective. The problem is, as you pointed out, there simply is a lack often of readily available reductions locally, and that's a bit of a chicken and egg problem, but this market will be scaling tremendously in the years to come. It has to help companies meet their commitments, and that's why we're currently involved in a very aggressive reassessment of different options across there, and how do we help supply that emerging market demand.
Thank you, Craig. And Natalie, from your perspective, having dove into this process, how do the distinctions mean anything to you when you're looking at different types of offset options? Was it sort of confusing to dive into that and figure out which ones made the most sense? And maybe talk a little bit about that for a moment in terms of the different options that are out there.
Yeah, it is confusing from the buyer's perspective because there are so many things to keep in mind, and it's hard to weigh the trade-offs between them. So there's the categories Tim walked through, which are so important and avoided, reduced, removed. And then there's also, the core principles you want to think about that most of the certifications cover, like permanence. And then there's the question that Craig, you were talking about around location. And then there's also, there's other things to weigh too, like the type of emissions. We were looking to offset scope 1 emissions from the natural gas we use to heat our buildings. So we went down a long conversation around how important is it that our offsets be related to methane reductions to match up with the gas that we're offsetting. And obviously there's just all of those. And then you throw cost in there too, right? And so there's all of those trade-offs, and it's hard to figure out what the right balance is. Yeah. Oh, and then also we got nature-based, which we didn't even really talk about, that, there's a huge movement to invest in nature-based and projects with co-benefits. And obviously it's never possible to find one that's cost effective and hits all of those criteria. So you've got to compromise somewhere.
It's interesting. And one of the things that really surprised me as we started diving into this process was just how different some things are here in California because of cap and trade. Before we sort of dive deeper and maybe into the corporate side for a moment, I want to talk about cap and trade for a moment, because it does feel like it sort of distorts the process a little bit here in California. I don't know, Craig, do you have any thoughts to maybe share there to kind of kick things off for us around that topic?
Well, there's no question it skews the considerations big time. And one of your charts flagged the options of greatest interest to your audience. And the top three were energy related. The fact of the matter here is in California is energy largely gets captured under the compliance cap and trade program, and voluntary actions that happen outside of the boundaries of that program may not have any net effect. And the argument is simple. If you do something on a voluntary basis, it's just taking the need for the compliance companies to do that much more. So the cap is set, so you may reduce it by 10. That just means they don't have to reduce it by 10, and so the cap will remain where it is. So you don't get the bang for your buck that you're looking for. It doesn't mean that energy-related options don't make good investments. They're often the best available locally. But we've been looking at that problem of restricted options, particularly in compliance markets like California. And one of the solutions that we offer is a program that we call Climate Forward that allows companies, and this was originally devised under CEQA, but particularly if any company is dealing with a new investment of any sort that's creating new greenhouse gas emissions. So you're talking about a future stream of emissions. Why not also think right now about a future stream of emission reductions that complement that project, whatever it is. I don't care whether it's a new building, housing development, manufacturing facility, it doesn't matter. But think from the outset about what you can do to mitigate the impact fully of that investment. And that opens up a whole opportunity for many localized reductions that the offset market might not bring to the table.
So are you saying that people would basically be procuring offsets now for a future project? So before they even start the project, they're lining up the offsets in accordance with that?
Let me be clear, with Climate Forward, they're not offsets.
Okay.
Forecasted mitigation units, because you haven't actually generated the reductions yet. So that's why it's a forward-looking perspective that works fine under something like CEQA. We think it has applications for a company's overall corporate footprint, but there's ongoing debate internationally what the proper accounting rules are for different types of credits and acceptable actions, and whether it can be ex post or ex ante. And it's not a one size fits all. So I just wanted to be clear about that. But specifically, if one's focusing on trying to create more localized benefits, the Climate Forward program allows you to look at dealing better with EJ concerns, for example, simply because you can target projects directly in those communities that lower emissions and bring those benefits to that community.
Interesting. Tim, along those same lines with cap and trade, how do you deal with that? I know you guys have customers here in California, you have customers around the world. Does cap and trade affect some of the work that you do?
Not in large sense. So we do have clients that we work with on the corporate side, across the country, globally. They're mostly looking to procure carbon credits from the voluntary carbon market, but not within the compliance market like cap and trade. So yeah, there is a distinction there. Folks are interested in projects locally, globally, and so we don't necessarily delve too far into the compliance market scheme when talking about these voluntary corporate purchases.
Great. And then Natalie, cap and trade wouldn't affect you because you're not regulated in that way. And just want to make that sort of clear for our audience today. But I don't know if you have any thoughts on cap and trade. I want to make sure you have some space to address it.
Thank you. Definitely not an expert on it, but happy to be in a market that has it in place. Yeah.
So sort of transitioning back to these corporate commitments for a moment, maybe you could talk a little about your thought process, Natalie, and kind of like how carbon offsets sort of fit into your net zero strategy or carbon reduction strategy, and kind of how you went about that. I think it'd be great to talk about that a little bit.
Sure. Well, we committed to, in real estate, there's that kind of World Green Business Council has a net zero carbon buildings framework, and we committed to that, which tied us to being carbon neutral by 2030. We were like, well, we can do that before, we can do it by 2025. And then, and we had a plan, and kind of a science-based plan to get there, largely by enrolling in green power plans, which happily, because we're in all of these West Coast jurisdictions, we have. And a lot of our buildings are already enrolled in. even 100% green power already. And we've got plans to do more of that over time and, continue our work around energy efficiency and on-site renewables. So we were looking at the modeling and we thought we could get there. We thought, there's probably still going to be a place for offsets in that strategy. As I said, for the natural gas we use to heat our buildings, because I don't know that we can convert our entire building away from natural gas, our entire portfolio, even in that extended time frame. But then COVID happened and we realized, our energy use is probably going to go way up, actually, and we're not converted into all of these green power plants yet. And we really didn't want to see our carbon footprint go up, in line with our energy, for those who aren't as close to the topic, like energy is going up in commercial buildings because we're running our HVAC systems longer and harder to keep the indoor air quality safe. So then we accelerated our offset purchase largely because we just wanted to decouple carbon from energy so that we were never put in a position where we'd have to trade off between safety and our carbon footprint. And so now here we are, and I'm proud of the work we've done, but well aware that there's room for improvement. And so, and lots of big questions we talked about around what is our strategy for offsets going on, and also how is the market going to evolve? What type of products are coming available on the market? Where is pricing going? That's a giant question mark in my mind with all this demand coming online. Pricing is, I think, going to go through the roof, right? So yeah, how does this play out for us as a long-term business strategy? There's a lot that we still don't know.
Interesting. And Tim, going to you for a moment, I know your company does work on carbon offsets for a variety of clients. How are you seeing companies sort of engage in this process? Similar to Natalie's experience, and what are you kind of seeing happening in the market, right now?
Yeah, I think the folks that we work with, certainly they're approaching it in a very thoughtful way. So they've set a internal corporate commitment, whether that be net zero, carbon neutral, carbon negative. They themselves do their own sort of internal core calculus exercise. They figure out which emissions they can abate across scopes 1 through 3. For those emissions that they cannot abate, they look to procure carbon offsets to address those emissions. I think there's been sort of a shift in thinking a little bit, and folks are really, again, trying to approach this in a mindful, sort of thoughtful way, in the sense of wanting to avoid reputational risk, and making sure that their credits that they're going to purchase are of high quality. Some of the things that we kind of look at to define that are additionality baseline. So additionality in the sense of, would a project happen if not for a certain voluntary carbon payment or carbon finance? Making sure baselines for projects are set appropriately so that they're not set below initial carbon stocks, which would constitute overcrediting on projects. Durability, so kind of looking at how long is that carbon stored for. Some projects don't necessarily have a durability component. Renewable projects, for example, renewable energy, clean cook stoves, those are meritorious in their own right. Renewables are great, we need a lot of them. Clean cook stoves, great, helps to avoid indoor air pollution and the public health ailments that come with that. But making sure that appropriate durability terms are set for those projects that do actually store carbon. Leakage, so making sure that the introduction of a certain project does not then just displace an emitting activity to a different geographic location, parcel of land. Do no harm, we kind of mentioned that a little bit, but making sure that a project doesn't introduce any negative consequences locally, globally, in the sense of economic, social, environmental impacts. On the flip side of that coin, then really trying to explore if and what the co-benefit landscape looks like. Nature-based solutions that Natalie mentioned, they do have just a slew of co-benefits, which is great. So kind of exploring that space as well. So those are some of the things that we look at to really help steer that corporate demand signal towards voluntary offset credit purchases. I think we've also seen too more of a keen interest in carbon removal offset credits, which don't necessarily constitute a large part of the market at present, but it's a rapidly evolving space in terms of suppliers that are kind of throwing their hat in the ring, whether it be more nature-based solutions, forestry projects, soil carbon, peatland and wetland restoration and the like, all the way to engineered solutions like direct air capture, carbon mineralization, and so forth. So I think there's a keen interest too in just having, and we mentioned this earlier as well, but just having more options on the table for companies to pursue when thinking about how to steer and direct their carbon credit purchases.
Does more options maybe also create option anxiety on some level? I feel like it's already sort of challenging. I know it's nice for people to pick their projects, but does that maybe cause people to be concerned about doing the wrong thing and not doing something maybe as quickly or at all? Does that seem like an issue to you?
It's a great question. I would say the pros of more options on the table kind of outweigh the cons of perhaps a more a convoluted space to try and navigate. I think folks want to do well for the climate. They want to make sure that their project, their voluntary payments really do have attendant carbon benefits and then other non-carbon benefits, depending on their interests, their needs, and so forth. And I think, optionality in terms of, the opportunity space to procure carbon offset credits is certainly outweighs any potential negative consequences of just making it harder to navigate.
Yeah, and Craig, maybe I'll go to you just for a second to chime in on that question. But to start, I was wondering if you could maybe comment a little bit on the durability issue that Tim raised, and kind of what does that really mean, and kind of unpacking that durability in the context of what's the additionality of an offset, right? Because those are all important. But could you talk about that a little bit?
Was that to me or to Natalie? I'm sorry.
Oh, to you, Craig. I'm sorry. Yeah.
Absolutely, and I wanted to follow on from Tim's comment. He made some excellent points about the concern in the marketplace. A couple of things. There's a lot of intense international focus right now on bringing more clarity to this market, defining as a larger commodity market what quality means. And I think over the next few years we're going to see a lot more visibility into what that means in the market, and the prices are going to reflect it. The other thing that both Tim had mentioned and Natalie was talking about, the strategy they've got. In my experience, companies are very cautious right now, partly to avoid concerns that they did the wrong thing or it was greenwashing or whatever it is. We have got to change the mentality now on that. We've been discussing appropriate measurement methods and strategies for decades now. And going back to what I said earlier, and you highlighted it, humanity is out of time. I mean, look around, we are frying this planet. It is much more important that companies who are in good faith doing the right thing get credit for doing that. Doesn't mean we don't have ongoing discussions that can they do better. But this, backcasting or backbiting approach to saying, you didn't do it the way I would have done it, you've done something wrong, is frankly keeping tens of billions of dollars idle on the sidelines when we need it deployed and making a difference. And so we need a positive, constructive approach saying, great for what you did. We'd like you to work on these things moving forward, but keep greenlighting it and accelerating action. And right now it's having the opposite reaction with the right intentions, but the wrong impact, because companies are sitting on the sidelines too expensive and we can't afford that.
No, and you just touched on the next question I was going to dive into, which is, what are some of the challenges that companies are facing right now in diving into this? And that's a great statement. It's so important to maintain positivity. I feel like sometimes we have that natural tendency in our world to sort of pick at people, for not necessarily doing the absolute best thing, but the fact that they're doing things, and we need people doing things right now, and there's so many people who aren't doing anything is really, really important. What are some of the other challenges that you think companies are facing right now, Craig? And then I'll turn that over to maybe Natalie.
Well, I do think that fear of being accused of failure or incorrect investments is the biggest barrier right now, and we have to overcome that. And just recognize along the way, we're going to make mistakes, but as long as it's well-intentioned, we fix it and we move on. You highlighted the magnitude of those challenges. And so as we scale up markets here, I think that's one of the biggest limitations right now, precisely because companies now want to jump into the market to meet their net zero or carbon neutral commitments. The demand for credits is going to be an order of magnitude greater than it is today. That's the way markets work, though. I can tell you right now from talking to the various project developers out there, they are working furiously to bring more scale to market. That's happening worldwide. So it's going to take some time, but it took a while for companies to begin to present that signal to project developers that it was worthwhile to invest in new projects. So it has been a chicken and egg problem. I hope we're overcoming that. I think there's too many people trying to provide advice to companies about what's the optimal strategy. But the optimal strategy is get active, get in the game, make a difference.
Oh, well said. Natalie, any thoughts on your end, having been through it? Like, what are some of the challenges that companies are facing, and kind of how do they minimize that risk and diving into this process?
First of all, I couldn't agree more with everything Craig said. I know personally so many people in my role who have not yet transitioned to being fully carbon neutral because of the fear of getting it wrong. And it just feels like, okay, well, like you can't, isn't there room for like an A level strategy while you work towards an A plus? Can't you get credit for it does, you can recognize you're not an A plus, but like, can't you get some credit for doing as quite a lot? So I totally agree with that. The other main challenge is, and this is a little bit more wonky, but from the corporate perspective, there are a lot of different ratings agencies out there and membership groups and compliance, not like voluntary things that we participate in, and they all have different methodologies and different definitions. And we're just like, we do our greenhouse gas accounting in alignment with the greenhouse gas protocol. We have our financial auditors assure it. And through that, we can take credit for the renewables that are already on the California grid. And I was just in an argument with the RE100 Alliance this morning, and they won't let us take credit for that. And, so there's just, there's totally different methodologies that make it extraordinarily confusing for us, and which adds another layer of stress when we're trying to figure out, okay, how many offsets do we need to buy? What type of offsets? Do we need RECs or not? And you're trying to lock in multi-year contracts so that to mitigate against price increases. But when you have total lack of visibility into those methodologies, it's very stressful. I recognize not everyone's in that wonky world. That's kind of a unique problem for us. The other one I would say that was also in that world is a lot of the current kind of ratings frameworks like CDP, like GRES, they reward year over year performance improvement. And so what we're finding now is, because we went carbon neutral last year, we're going to start losing points on those frameworks because we're at zero and we stay at zero. And so now we're have to go back and read the methodology and maybe be like, maybe we report a different way. So we try to game the system, which is all very frustrating.
That does sound really complex though. And, again, if we want more companies to engage in this process, that can be really overwhelming to juggle all the things that you just mentioned. And it's amazing that some of these standards don't look at eventually, it has to be year on year improvement. But what happens when you get to zero? Like that, they should have thought about that, right? Like that's where we want people to be on some level. Tim, any thoughts from you just in terms of challenges for companies in engaging in this process, and again, how do they minimize that risk?
I can't really speak to the question from the perspective of Natalie and perhaps Craig, but I think on the flip side of that coin, I'm really encouraged by just the flurry of commitments in general at the corporate level that have been made in recent past. And Ben, I think the slides mentioned over 1,500 or somewhere in that neighborhood. The first step is to make a commitment, right? The second step, devise a plan. Third step, execute if you really want to water it down. So that's really encouraging. And I think, Craig mentioned earlier just how quickly we've kind of seen this voluntary carbon market grow. Of course, do your best to reduce emissions where possible, given current technologies or state of technologies, current economics, and so forth. And then, look to offset, remove the remainder of the residual emissions. So I think that's really encouraging. The voluntary carbon market transacted somewhere in the neighborhood of 100 million tons worth of carbon credits in 2019. If we order magnitude scale by the end of this decade, we're then talking gigaton scale market. If every ton counts, which it certainly does, and every gigaton certainly counts. So, I think just the flurry of commitments is encouraging. That is the necessary first step. Then from there, of course, the hard work begins in terms of rolling up your sleeves, figuring out, coming up with a game plan for how to reduce emissions and just the overall climate strategy. But that's certainly been encouraging to watch over the past year or two.
We've got some good questions coming into the chat here. Just a reminder, if you have a question, drop it into the chat, but we have some good ones that are going to be meaty to unpack. Really quick, Tim, before we move on, could you explain the durability part a little bit more of your comment earlier? Because I got a little question on that here in the chat, and I think that that's kind of important in terms of the length of time that offsets are supposed to last for, because I think that surprises some people, first.
Yeah, absolutely. So durability is also kind of referred to as permanence, which Natalie mentioned earlier. So for carbon offset projects that do have a carbon storage component, thinking about how long is that carbon stored for? What is sort of the integrity of that storage mechanism? When we're talking sort of nature-based solutions, we're generally talking on the order of decades. So forestry systems and soil carbon and so forth. And then when we're talking about more engineered solutions, whether you're injecting CO2 into the subsurface or mineralizing in rock form, then you're talking centuries to millennia time scale. So just trying to understand that sort of spectrum of the timing in terms of how long the carbon is stored for or intended to be stored for is something that we look at as just sort of a core metric by which we evaluate projects.
Thank you. Thank you for providing a little bit of that clarity. Now I want to switch a little bit to talk about just the locality sort of issue. And, oftentimes people talk about offsets and sort of the challenge of, having a company that's emitting pollution in one area, right? And then offsetting that with something around the world. How do we create more local projects, and what are some of the challenges there? And Craig, maybe you could kick us off. You talked a little bit about your Climate Forward program you have, but how can we find ways to do more local projects so we can have more co-benefits locally?
Now, the first point I'd just like to make is a scientific one when it comes to greenhouse gases. The location of a ton reduction doesn't matter. We're talking other social and political considerations, which is fine. I understand those are powerful drivers. We've looked long and hard here in California about how to create more localized offset protocols, particularly in the urban areas. And as I was describing earlier, just for a variety of reasons, there's a number of barriers, but the biggest one is simply a lack of availability. It's not like we haven't figured out how to unlock it. They're just not there, because a lot of them do tend to be energy related. And as I said earlier, that tends to get captured under the cap and trade program. Honestly, that was one of the prime motivations for developing the Climate Forward program. Companies do want to invest locally here in California. By doing this on an ex-ante basis or futures basis, if you will, you can start generating emission reductions, and it opens up the whole panoply of additional project types that wouldn't typically be available in the market. And it could be anything from energy efficiency investments in buildings that are in urban areas, to putting PV panels on low-income homes, to electric buses in low-income communities. There's a whole variety of strategies available there, but they would be, for the reasons I mentioned earlier, frowned upon under a compliance regime of the cap and trade program. So we have to think creatively about that. Particularly for the urban areas, the concerns are less so out in the rural areas, because there are opportunities out there, forestry projects being one, out in the Central Valley being a lot of methane recovery projects, for example, at a dairy operation. But just realistically, it's a very short list of possibilities in an urban area. And you mentioned urban forestry. We've had that as a protocol for many, many years. There are not really viable projects under that. And there's a whole host of reasons for it. Part of its scale, it's a very costly project. Part of its ownership, once you plant trees in an urban area, who's responsible for the upkeep? The mortality rates tends to be high. As Tim was pointing out in the question of permanence, we define permanence for nature-based options as typically 100 years. That's a long time frame, very long time frame, and there are ways to address that. And California's done that with its forestry protocol. Something like north of 160 million offsets come out of the forestry sector, and they're permanent for 100 years, and we are going to get those benefits. But for urban areas, it's a much bigger challenge. So I would encourage people to think maybe beyond the offset world if they really want to emphasize localized reduction. But that partly depends on the location. Since we're talking about LA here, we've looked long and hard at it. There are limited offset opportunities, but a huge amount of opportunities to address local concerns, get some of those co-benefits, deal with EJ concerns, and still get very viable emission reductions.
Do you have an example, Craig, of climate forward in action? Is there, a specific project you can kind of point to and mention?
Absolutely. We worked, one company we worked with is 5 Point that many may know is building a planned community that will be carbon neutral, up in northern LA County, Newhall Ranch. One of the projects they've invested in to mitigate the impact of that future community is putting PV panels on low-income homes in South LA. It's directly addressing localized concerns, and that's a great example of a project where they've stepped up to the plate and are making a difference. They're also going into the same communities and putting insulating pool covers on to reduce the consumption of natural gas for public pool heating. Again, another niche market, and it's really going to be a net climate benefit. So that's just a couple of quick examples. Urban forestry certainly is another option. Reforestation is another possibility, but again, you have to look at the locality you're dealing with, and it's really an economically viable solution. Can it scale, and what do you have to pay to actually get on a per ton cost to get reductions?
Yeah, those two examples you just mentioned are great. Those are exactly sort of the things that we want to see more on a local level, and I think companies would want to see that stuff happening in their communities and know that they're making that kind of impact when they are making these commitments. That's great. That's great. Tim, any thoughts from your end in terms of localization of offsets and anything you want to share there? Maybe pricing, even talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, I think at the outset, two project types that really lend themselves well to local benefits, co-benefits are urban forestry. So Craig kind of mentioned that. I mean, I kind of see that as a low risk, high reward type of project, especially, with the recent heat waves that the US experienced and elsewhere, just helping to reduce heat related illnesses, for example, mortality and so forth. Just a great project, host of co-benefits. I think blue carbon is another one in a similar vein. Can help with wave attenuation. It can help with reducing impacts of shorelines and coastal erosion, marine habitat creation, and so forth. And blue carbon ecosystems are certainly major carbon sinks. So I think those are two project types that appear low risk, high reward, and certainly can lend themselves and induce a number of co-benefits to help local communities.
I actually have a question on that for you, Craig. What type of protocols are you all thinking about going forward? Are you thinking, how are you thinking about blue carbon, or even some of the engineered solutions we talked about, like DIC, and recognizing maybe that's not going to happen in LA, but potentially could be a little bit more local than like a tropical rainforest project?
Yeah, so we've been basically continuing examining a lot of them. We've got, it's down in Mexico, but there's mangrove restoration. We're also looking at similar options in the Gulf Coast. Again, a critical ecological benefit while it's also sequestering carbon. Tim's working on a whole, working in the engineered solution space for carbon removal is huge. There are a variety of different options out there. We've seen possibilities on the books. They haven't been brought to market scale yet of even removing CO2 directly from the atmosphere while you're producing water. Not that anybody out west needs more water, right? But that's a creative solution. There's a variety of different proposals for some outlandish, like ocean iron fertilization, but there's also others just involved in the deep well injection of chemicals to get carbon to be absorbed out of the atmosphere and essentially deposited for centuries, in the earth, either out in the ocean or land. So those haven't achieved market applicability yet. There's a lot of people working on it, and the IPCC has made it clear we won't hit our targets unless we get those solutions to market. That's everything from carbon capture and storage to direct air capture to some of the more novel ideas I was just mentioning.
Very cool. Great question. Great question. Sort of our last, sort of formal question here on the panel. I just want to talk for a moment just about, what are some creative things that companies can do to maybe help? And one of the things we came up with in our laser group is around pooling our purchasing power. Any thoughts on that? Could pooling purchasing power to either create more of a market pull or help maybe solve some challenges collectively? Could that be helpful? And maybe I'll start with you, Tim. Any thoughts on, is there a power in pooling purchasing power, or is that just the market? Like, what are your thoughts there?
I mean, I absolutely think there's a lot of merit to kind of pooling that demand to, target new supply, high quality projects and so forth. Kind of tying back into the engineering piece, and Craig mentioned the IPCC numbers, and they are certainly daunting. We need to potentially remove anywhere from 100 billion to 1 trillion tons of CO2 from the atmosphere by the end of the century. Given those numbers are essentially at zero, and we have a long way to go. I mean, it's a Herculean challenge, but one that we absolutely have to pursue if we want to limit temperature overshoot and limit, climate impacts and the detriments that we're already seeing today. We've seen kind of a dearth of capital support and funding for a lot of these engineered types of solutions, and we certainly convey the importance of sort of a portfolio approach. So pursuing, nature-based solutions all the way to these engineered solutions. And there's just, on the engineering side, there just hasn't been a ton of support yet today. That could certainly be an opportunity for sort of these pooled funding streams to help support and launch some of these projects, whether it's at the pilot demonstration scale, literally things just coming out of the lab, or something that is more commercial ready and ready to deploy at scale. So certainly see the merits, the value in that type of construct, and hope to see more of that moving forward.
Craig, any thoughts there?
I'll put this in probably the naive panacea category, but back to Natalie's point about worrying about the pushback from the different standard organizations and NGOs. I'd like to see companies band together and say, enough is enough. We're willing to invest our money. Feel free to continue to give us advice, but we're moving forward and we're not going to wait for clarity from you because we don't have that time.
Oh, that's an excellent point. Yeah.
Case in point, just Microsoft committed to mitigating the impact of its entire footprint going back to its founding. It's an incredibly ambitious goal. Why are they taking advice from anybody else on it? What's the best way to do it? It's a laudable goal on their part. They ought to be congratulated and supported every step of the way. As long as they're taking credible steps, we all ought to stand up and applaud.
Totally agree.
Natalie, any thoughts from you just on again, what can companies be doing to be creative and supporting each other? I like this idea of banding together and creating something there. Maybe that's something we can do on our laser group, is to form some sort of commitment letter or something like that. But any thoughts on your end, just in terms of pulling purchasing power or being creative from a corporate standpoint?
Well, I think you mentioned this, Tim, like we can pool our purchasing power, and we can also pool our, investment resources, right, to support some of the newer technologies or projects and help them get off the ground, even when they're kind of in the pre-offset stage, even when you're not going to actually offset any of your actual carbon with it, because you think it's a worthwhile thing to do. And we've been trying to do some of that. And Ben, I know you have a ton of that stuff going on through the Net Zero Accelerator at USGBC. And there's cool technology coming out of LA. So that's one thing that I'm excited about, and I think we could use more of. Yeah,
no, I couldn't agree more. All right, I'm going to dive into some of our questions here in the chat. There's some good ones in here that are going to be pretty meaty. So again, please feel free to drop questions in the chat. You can also send them to me directly. So one question we have is, people use carbon neutral and net zero interchangeably, but is the former offsetting your remaining emissions and the latter creating zero emissions? And how is that possible? And if that question made sense to anyone, does that make sense?
I know there's like different definitions on this, but I effectively feel like they're the same thing. They both allow for offsetting.
Fair point. Yeah.
I agree. That's another area where there's an attempt to try to provide some differentiation. And there are, Natalie's correct, there are different definitions, but at the end of the day, who cares? Just
Yes.
pathway. And if debate is, are you at net zero or carbon neutral? I suggest you declare victory and throw a party. Keep going.
Next question we have here is, can you talk a little bit about vintage and the thoughts on short-term projects such as NCX, which is formerly known as Sylvia Terra, I guess. But any thoughts on the vintage of projects? Feel free to just jump in here. Raise your hand. I can call on you.
We've been advised to find something within the last 3 years and not go prior to that. I don't know, Tim, what do you tell your clients?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that there's a standard rule of thumb. I mean, we typically say, half decade, but it's really ultimately up to the client, and just from a definitional standpoint. So, vintage is, when the actual carbon benefit or emissions benefit occurs, then that precedes the issuance, then a carbon credit is issued and then available for purchase, and then a credit will ultimately be purchased and retired. So, yeah, in terms of when the carbon benefit occurred, again, it's really subjective and kind of up to the folks that we work with, but we tend to not go back too far in time and kind of lean towards, within a decade at most.
We've got a slightly different take on it because we define what's acceptable as a vintage when we develop an offset protocol. And if you're doing a reduction before that, it's simply not going to be eligible. And I would argue that any project developer that's brought credits to market using an acceptable protocol, that vintage shouldn't matter. Now, I'm well aware from work I've done with companies that, as Natalie and Tim are highlighting, they don't want to buy real old credits because it raises questions about, are they truly additional? A lot of that goes back to credits under the Kyoto Protocol from 2000 on. And that's a viable question, but I think moving forward, if the question would be, was this a high quality credit when it was created? The fact that someone was bringing it to market earlier or putting it in their portfolio should still make it a very viable instrument for meeting their targets.
Interesting question. Here's one that I think we've kind of hit on a little bit, and this was the first question, but I think we need to hit on this. And the question is are a lot of these carbon neutral and offset commitments, are they greenwashing in that someone's going out to rainforests in poor countries or other places where indigenous people who already lived and depended on these forests for generations, and then is setting them aside as protected reserve for their offsetting for their own carbon, for their wasteful practices? She says high flying lifestyles here, but they could be just in operations, corporate operations. How do we prevent things from happening and make sure that those programs are actually not doing more harm than good? And I think that's a lot of the work that you do, Craig. So maybe I'll let you speak to that for a moment.
Well, that's having a clear understanding of what defines high quality and what doesn't. Kim was alluding to that list earlier. They got to be real, additional, permanent, verifiable, and enforceable. And those are obviously, catch terms for the market. But if you drill down on each of those concepts and understand what they are, each credit will represent a real additional reduction to the atmosphere, a net environmental benefit. There are definitely providers out there that are bringing some questionable credits to market. I can say unashamedly, that is not the Climate Action Reserve. We're constantly in debates around that because people have their different opinions on it, particularly around nature-based solutions, because they tend to be fairly complex. The subtext of the question, I think, partly goes to a lot of tropical rainforest investments, and it's not an area that we've been playing in recently. There are a lot of key concerns there. How can you have credits in Brazil when the rate of deforestation continues at such a high pace? I don't know the details around a lot of that, but it's a very valid question to ask. That whether there's greenwashing going on, but if it's an earnest investment let's have a good debate about whether the benefits were truly achieved. But if quality principles were followed in getting there, we should be assured we've got it done. And if not, let's just fix it moving forward. And the market is starting to distinguish a lot around those quality characteristics. Not enough yet, but over the next few years, we're going to see a lot more clarity come to market about what constitutes a high quality credit versus not.
No, well said. And it does seem like the market's sort of evolving in that, hopefully it's going to be less and less attractive for those kinds of projects because they're going to be less verifiable and valuable for companies. Next question that came in here, science-based targets does not allow carbon offsets in their net zero certification. Are there any conversations with them to change this approach? Is that something, Tim, you might be aware of?
No, unfortunately, I'm not aware of those ongoing conversations.
Craig or Natalie? They said SBTI, but I'm assuming they mean science-based targets.
Science-based target initiative. SBTI, science-based target initiative, sounds good. Who doesn't like a science-based target? The only one that's got a science-based target is the planet and the IPCC trying to tell us what we need to get to. I don't know what it means at the corporate level. And it partly relates back to what Natalie was saying. There's another standard out there trying to get traction for the right way to do this. For an individual company, I don't know what that science-based target really translates into. I know one thing, companies should be doing whatever they can to drive their current carbon footprint to at least zero, and depending on what their history has been, continue going to make up for past historical contributions, which frankly applies to the entire United States, given our role in the climate crisis.
Wouldn't you love to see that commitment from the government to go back to the founding of the U.S. to avoid our emissions? That would be amazing.
I think there's a lot of ways the U.S. can address. California is facing that. We're all focused on getting the 2030 and 2045 goals, but we're proud of talking about how we're the 5th largest economy in the world. We got that way by basically being the 12th largest greenhouse gas emitter on the planet as well. So just getting to zero or carbon neutral, however you want to characterize it, won't be sufficient. However, that ongoing strategy involves continuing to invest in emission reductions or helping, one way is just to help other countries get to net zero. We have a green finance obligation, I think, to the rest of the world. And all of us need to help bring all of our brethren along to make sure that we can achieve the climate targets that are going to make a difference and keep us below 1.5 degrees centigrade.
There's still maybe time to run on this platform before the recall election in November. I'm not sure, but I think we've got to bring California back to zero platform there on some level. What's that, Craig?
I'd rather have a beer and watch the chaos.
Count me in for that one. So someone says, I've heard good and bad about, and I'm not familiar with this acronym, REDD plus projects, RED plus projects. Does anyone have any thoughts on those?
RED plus is primarily what tropical deforestation.
Oh, okay.
It's very contentious. It's one of the areas that we haven't gotten into precisely because of the controversy around it. We also, at this moment, we're not operating in tropical, rainforest countries. That may change in the future. RED plus can be done correctly. California's been looking at it, and I think that's an important way to look at it. You can reward certain types of activities like reforestation, maybe shy away from avoiding conversion crediting while there's still massive amounts of deforestation going on. So there's different ways to think about it, but yeah, you've got to be very careful that are you achieving the benefits you hope to achieve? And then the whole question of permits is always going to be there with nature-based solutions. It's a funny thing about Mother Nature. It doesn't lend itself to putting in a clean little box and, oh yeah, it's going to work. Our forestry protocol, which was adopted by California Resources Board, the compliance program, I'm convinced is leading to more mature, higher carbon uptake in forests long term. But are there hiccups along the way? Of course. One of the biggest forestry projects on the books, it's not registered with us, but is burning up in Oregon right now. People thought about that when they developed the protocol, though. So the benefits are still there. It doesn't mean there won't be setbacks, but you reset, you move forward, do a better job next time.
Yeah. Any thoughts on that, Tim or Natalie? And then I have and this kind of relates to this next question here, because I think you hit on some of this, Craig, but what are some of the red flags that people should look for when evaluating projects? Tim or Natalie, any thoughts there?
Yeah, I think just going back to baseline setting, certainly in certain natural systems, if looking to make sure that those baselines from which you're going to measure a carbon accrual benefit from a project is kind of set at initial carbon stock levels. Sometimes baselines can be set below carbon stock levels, and then when credits are issued, there's that sort of that difference is credited even though that carbon storage is already there on the landscape. So making sure accurate baseline setting is followed or adhered to is certainly important. Again, just kind of going back to some of these principles, but I think another neglected one or often neglected one is just kind of trying to account for market leakage for a lot of projects. So again, if I'm going to do a project in location A, does that just displace an emitting activity to location B? And markets are global, leakage can be global. So it's a very tricky exercise, but certainly something to take into account when trying to assess, whether or not purchases of high quality.
I wonder if you two would think about certification, right? I mean, there's like all these different certified offsets out there, VCS and gold standard. And what are you, I mean, when we were going through our RFP process and looking at it, everything was certified with one framework or another. It wasn't hard to find. And I don't know if you all have a point of view on which ones are better than others.
Well, that's setting me up. Of course, we've got the high. But let me tell you why. It starts with how the protocol was developed. We do it in a very public, transparent process. Anybody who's interested can participate in it. And that sort of sunshine approach, we think, leads to a higher quality outcome. The use of an independent third-party verifier is critical. If I wouldn't buy credits from somebody who said this is good, and by the way, I certified that it was good. There's an industry out there that will do that. That's just another consideration. The part of it, in addition to the transparency, is who is really doing the certifying. You mentioned like Vera, us, the gold standard. We represent a handful of recognized registries around the planet that have that high quality process. I think be very leery of anybody who's also originating the credits and selling them. Want to be very clear, the Climate Action Reserve never owns a single ton of credits. Our job is simply to certify the quality. And that's by design, because we don't want to have any conflict of interest attached to ownership. So that's another area to keep in mind. But there's ongoing discussion about the best way to define quality. Having a good permanence requirement, is critical. I said we use 100 years. Others out there are not using that, and yet they're giving away 100 years worth of benefits by using what's called the 100-year global warming potentials. That's a bit of a red flag right there. So there's a variety of considerations like that. All I know is that I'm confident in every credit we offer through our registry is of high quality. You can count.
Tim, do you want to respond to Natalie's question at all?
Yeah, I think the focus should be on the protocol methodology level. So a project is only good as the protocol methodology that it has to adhere to and become accredited towards. So I think the focus is sort of on that, making sure that protocol, that methodology adheres to rigorous scientific standards and so forth. I think that's where attention needs to be paid when kind of trying to parse out quality from non-quality projects. But again, projects have to adhere to and become accredited towards those protocols, methodologies, and I think that's where the focus can and should lie.
Mm-hmm.
One differentiator that we brought to the market, one of the reasons I joined the reserve, my time working on the Kyoto Protocol, getting down into the weeds, but they allow the project developer to define the baseline on any project around the planet. At the reserve, we take what we call a standardized baseline approach. We take that decision-making out of the hands of the project developer because they have every interest to bend the analysis to benefit their project. And we predefine that in our protocol. Here's what's going to be acceptable as a creditable activity, and you're going to have to follow the protocol. Other organizations have chosen not to do that.
I got a few more questions here. I'm gonna roll through. This question is kind of directed at you, Tim, but I guess anyone can answer. But you mentioned that demand for carbon removal credits is increasing. Can you or anyone else on the panel talk about what types of projects you have in mind there and what's driving that demand?
Yeah, I think from our standpoint, anecdotally, I think a lot of the demand that we're seeing is still mostly focused in the nature-based space. I think on the whole, we're still seeing afforestation, reforestation being sort of a prominent focus of a lot of voluntary interest. Soil carbon, I think, it's certainly a nascent, but we're seeing increasing interest in that space. I think the soil carbon is a little trickier. I still think there are some scientific questions that need to be ironed out, but Craig, perhaps you can talk to sort of your soil carbon protocol, but that's, I think a rapidly developing area of interest for a lot of folks. There's certainly interest in the engineered space, and when we touch upon a couple of the methods, direct air capture, mineralization. But again, there's just because they are so relatively costly, I think, we just haven't seen as keen of interest in some of the engineered solutions as we have in the nature-based.
I agree with that on the offset side, but I also think like looking down the line at what's not yet eligible, but the huge interest in building materials as a carbon sink, direct air capture, and all other, all the emerging technologies. Yeah.
Largest emitters on the planet, particularly those cranking out carbon-based projects like oil and gas companies, are keenly interested in the engineered solutions. And it's still expensive, but there are a number of projects out there that we're learning by doing, we're driving down the costs. And as I said earlier, the IPCC has stated that humanity won't meet its climate goals without that option on the table. So we need to figure out how to drive down the costs and bring it to scale that can really start to make a significant difference.
This is kind of a fun question, maybe a good one to end our Q&A conversation on. So let's talking about local projects for a second and seeing these effects at home. How can we make this happen, and what are some ideas? Could we do a project around transitioning decommissioned oil fields to urban forests? So this is, I guess, kind of a blue sky question, but what are some of the cool project ideas we may be able to look at here locally? Granted that every project has challenges, it sounds like.
Somebody stole my idea. I've been talking to legislators in Sacramento that don't think offsets address EJ concerns. I said the only difference is they're trying to reduce emissions, we're trying to eliminate them. So, I'd like nothing better than refineries here in the state to become a park of some sort named after some of the climate skeptics, those that didn't think that we could get it done. There's clearly the potential for that. We're not quite there yet, but it's a great way to make an investment. A lot of good real estate there that we got to put out of business and put it to a better use.
Fair answer. Any ideas, Tim or Natalie, on just creative local projects we might be able to see, or things that you've thought about? There's no bad answer here. These are just ideas.
I was kind of pumped about urban reforestation a while ago, and the more I learn about it, the more intimidating it becomes. But agree, Craig, it would be awesome if we could do it. I don't know though. I think other areas where, at least personally, I haven't learned as much, and so perhaps there's interesting local potential there. Would be if we define local as like the Southern California region more broadly, like soil carbon or even blue carbon emerging.
Yeah, I would certainly echo soil carbon, blue carbon. I think another one too is just kind of thinking about potentially down the road. Direct air capture, BECCS. California has a lot of CO2 storage capacity in the subsurface, in saline formations, depleted oil and gas reservoirs. That could certainly be amenable to certain engineered solutions in the future. Something else to potentially hope for one day.
I like those. I like those ideas. This is where we need to get together over a beer at some point, when that's possible. Again, I thought we were almost there, but maybe we're not. But to talk through it and come up with some good creative ideas. So we finished the Q&A portion of our time today. As I said, I want to give a little bit of space for people who want to hang out and just chat a little bit. But I want to say thank you to Craig, Natalie, and Tim for joining us. For spending the time with us today. I want to say thank you to everyone who worked on the white paper, especially some of the folks in our Green Building Corps and in our LA Sustainability Executives Roundtable. Really appreciate everyone's help, and hope everyone enjoys the rest of the afternoon. And I look forward to seeing this book continue to be written around offsets in this chapter of history. I hope that we can work through some of these things, but I couldn't agree more with some of the sentiment here. We need to reward people for doing stuff that's making an impact. And not get too caught up in the details. Details are important, but not when we've got a race here to try to save the planet. We still need to make sure we're watching the details, but we need to be rewarding people for doing the good work. I couldn't agree with that more. So thank you, everyone. And as I said, I'm going to hang out here. Don't feel obligated. We're going to close this at 5:30, so we've got 10 more minutes. If anyone wants to chat or ask questions or turn on the video and say hello, we can do that. We are people. We do exist. Don't forget that. No one's ever willing to be the first one to do this, by the way. No one's ever willing to do that.
Thanks, Ben.
There we go. We got someone. We got a person. Go for it.
I don't really have anything to say besides thank you. I just felt like I just didn't want you to leave you here alone.
I really appreciate that. Most of the time I'm left alone.
Yeah,
so I really appreciate it.
No, I really enjoyed the conversation. I think I'm really intrigued with this idea of how do you get local offsets both at scale and at some sort of economical cost, and appreciate the conversation around. Is it just looking at carbon, or do other benefits take the primary position, and the carbon comes second from a local perspective? So thanks for the good conversation.
No, I appreciate that, John. And it's so great. It's like the more we dive into everything, it's all interrelated, right? It's like, oh, we're just trying to address reducing carbon in the atmosphere, but yes, there's all these reasons that got there in the first place, and all these people who want to be first in line to see the positive impacts who are being negatively impacted now. So it's just everything's intersectional, right? And it's challenging. Any other thoughts? Anybody else want to share or say hello? We had one brave person. Sometimes that's all I can ask for.
You mentioned beer too often. They ran off to grab it.
I'm just thinking. I'm here in our office. We're in the office Tuesdays and Thursdays now, and I'm in like dire. There's like no coffee here anymore. I'm in dire need of a cup of coffee at this point. Well, like I said, I'll hang out for a little bit if anyone else wants to talk. But thank you, everyone. Great job, and I think we'll continue to pull on this thread in our laser group. I'd like to see us try to come up with some sort of group statement or commitment we can make across executives here. I think that'd be really helpful, even if it is just saying, hey, like, we need either some sort of standard or to be left alone if we're trying to do these projects in a certain way. I think that makes a lot of sense. All right. Well, with that, I'm gonna close it down. Thank you, everyone. Have a great afternoon, and hopefully we'll see you in person soon.
Thanks, Ben. Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Thanks, Ben. Thanks, everyone. Take care.